Pandispositionalism. Okay, Sam, over to you.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks, Amanda, again for the invite. I really appreciate it. Yeah, obviously, if you can't hear me for whatever reason, do interrupt on that in that case, so that I can sort my internet out if necessary. Great. Okay, so let's just give a bit of an introduction to the topic. So some philosophers think that there are such things as properties that are irreducibly modal, and these things are often called powers. That should be familiar to some of you at least. And then powers theorists like to use these powers to account for other phenomena of philosophical interest, particularly laws of nature and modality, right? But perhaps other things as well. So then the question arises, which properties are powers, or how far does the powers metaphysic extend, right? Is it the case that all properties are powers, or only some properties powers, or only the fundamental properties powers? So the point of this talk really is to argue that the answer to this question really is going to depend on the particular details of the metaphysics of powers that one endorses, right? And in particular, I'm going to argue that if powers are understood as, this is where it gets a bit jargony, but hopefully we'll unpack this as things go on, but if powers are understood as qualitative grounds of dispositions, then it turns out that all properties are powers. In other words, pandispositionalism is true. And I think this conclusion is significant because I think we should understand powers in this way. I've suggested we should think of them as qualitative grounds of dispositions, although unfortunately in this talk my arguments for this will be somewhat limited. So the conclusion is going to be more kind of conditional in form. It's going to be if we endorse qualitative this account of the metaphysics of powers, then pandispositionalism is true. But the thing is, because I think this probably is the right metaphysics of powers, it looks like we might have a stronger conclusion not far off, which is like, if we want to be powers theorists, then we should endorse full-blown pandispositionalism. So that's kind of an overview of the talk. Okay, so this is the plan, right? So in section 1, what I'm going to do is talk about Alexander Bird's account of powers and his argument against pandispositionalism, right? So this will be a kind of helpful way of setting up my debate, because he's got quite a nice argument against pandispositionalism, and so it will help to use that as kind of my opponent, I suppose. And then what I'm going to do is, in section 2, reassess Bird's argument against pandispositionalism. And the way I'll do this is by flagging some problems for Bird's account of the metaphysics of powers, which then motivates this alternative account of the metaphysics of powers, which I'll call QDE, for qualitative dispositional essentialism. And I'll show you that once we understand powers along the lines of QDE, as opposed to the way Bird understands them, then Bird's argument against pandispositionalism is rendered unsound. So that's all quite kind of negative. I'm just saying that we can block Bird's argument if we understand the metaphysics of powers in this way. But then in section 3, I'll try and push the thing a little bit further and say that actually for the existence of macro powers, a positive argument for the existence of macro powers, and in fact full-blown pandispositionalism. So that's how we're going to go. And then in section 4, if I've got time, I'll go over some objections and replies, but maybe they'll kind of come up in the Q&A anyway. Okay, so starting off thinking about Bird's account of the metaphysics of powers and his argument against pandispositionalism. Okay, so like I kind of hinted at, to understand Bird's argument against pandispositionalism, we really need to understand Bird's metaphysics of powers. So central to all accounts of powers is the notion of a disposition, where a disposition can be understood as something like a modal relation between stimulus and manifestation properties. So D is the disposition to S when M, this might be familiar. So then the example that is kind of helpful is that of fragility. It doesn't really matter if we think that's fundamental or not, it's just to illustrate the idea. So fragility is a disposition to shatter when stressed. So we can think of this as like a modal relation between the properties being stressed and shattering. So that's dispositionality. And then the point is that according to Bird, and like I say, this is important for his argument against pandispositionalism, a power is an ontic, so a real property as opposed to a mere predicatory property. A power is an ontic property that has a dispositional essence, right? So Bird thinks that what it is to be a power is to have this modal relation as part of the property's essence. And the other thing he says is that a power is an ontic property whose identity is given by its causal, dispositional, or nomic role. So the what it is to be, so if we're interested in powers, what it is to be this given power is to have this this dispositional kind of role. Okay. So then this implies something that Bird takes to be quite important, an important feature of the powers metaphysic, which is that powers are modally fixed properties, right? By which he means they have invariant characters across possible worlds. So there's no world in which charge warps space-time, right? That's not what charge does. The dispositional character of these properties is modally fixed. Okay, so Bird's got some arguments for powers which might be kind of familiar to some of you. One focuses on laws of nature, so he thinks that the dispositional nature of powers explains why there are irregularities in the pattern of property instantiation throughout space-time, and so this explains the laws of nature. And because powers are modally fixed, this accounts for the necessity of the laws, right? So because you can't change the dispositions that powers are associated with, it turns out that laws are necessary, kind of conditional upon the instantiation of the relevant powers. And he thinks that this is better than Humeanism, so the Lewisian view of laws is just descriptions of contingent regularities. And he thinks it's better than the Armstrongian nomic necessitation view of laws as like external governing relations. He's also open in more recent work to the idea that powers might be able to explain modality. So it looks like dispositions are associated with possibility, right? If there's a disposition with manifestation M, then it seems fair to say that it's possible that M obtains. So powers with their essences constituted by dispositions might be able to ground facts about what's possible. And then finally, property identity, right? So Bird thinks that the powers view gives a good account of property identity, and he says a property could not have a different set of dispositional relations with other properties P and Q. A property could not have a different set of dispositional relations with other properties. P and Q are the same property if and only if they have the same dispositional character, right? And importantly, we'll get onto this in a moment, this is supposed to be better than quiddatism, which says that properties are just primitively self-identical and distinct from other properties. So those are the kind of arguments that Bird thinks are good arguments for powers. And he's got some arguments, some sort of indirect arguments against macro powers, which are slightly less important for my purposes, but I'll mention them briefly, right? So some people have argued that there might be, powers at all levels, but Bird says, well, we don't need these powers, these high level powers, these macro powers, to account for laws of nature, because although there might be high level laws, there might be chemical laws, biological laws, these laws ultimately supervene on and so are explained by the lower level powers, right? All you need is fundamental powers to explain all the laws according to Bird. So there's no argument for macro powers there. And modality, the exact same idea, right? The thought is that sure, there are possibilities for higher level things, for tables and chairs and people and stuff, but ultimately these possibilities are going to supervene on the fundamental powers. So consideration of laws of modality doesn't motivate macro powers. And by macro powers, I'm just going to mean non-fundamental powers. That's kind of how Bird uses the term, so I'll follow him in that respect. So this is just sort of undermining the motivation for positing macro powers, but it's not a direct argument against Pandispositionalism. So having put these points out there, sort of maybe don't worry about them too much for the purposes of my argument. What's more important to my argument is Bird's direct argument against Pandispositionalism, which turns on this point about property identity. So Bird argues that while there are only two options concerning the identity of fundamental properties, quiddatism or the powers theory, this same dichotomy just doesn't hold for the macro powers, right? And this is because the identity of macro powers can be given in terms of composition or structure. And so Bird says, we've got the quote here, if one property is compounded out of other properties, then the identity of the property may be given by the nature of that composition. So the point here is that problems for quiddatism don't constitute a case in favor of macro powers. So again, this is a kind of undermining argument. So there's no positive reason from property identity to posit macro powers, but he goes further, right, and offers some concrete counterexamples which constitute a positive case against macro powers and Pandispositionalism. So the point is that these examples are supposed to be macro ontic properties whose essences are not dispositional, right? And so would falsify pandispositionalism. And the examples he gives are chemical properties, so aromaticity, the property of being a chemical compound that contains a benzene ring, right? We'll come back to that a little bit later. The property of being covalent, so of a bond in virtue of the electron distribution giving rise to the bond, being a transition element occupying a certain position in the periodic table. We've got biological properties too, so the property of being heterozygous at a particular locus, being a dinosaur as well, especially maybe a biological property, and medical properties such as pericardiality, so the property of surrounding the heart. These are all just supposed to be examples of properties, real existing ontic properties, which just aren't powers according to Bird, because their identity isn't given by dispositions, right? It's not that dispositions constitute their essences, it's that they're given, the identities of these properties is given in terms of structure or composition or something like that. So that's a direct argument against pandispositionalism there. Yeah, so I just said that part. Okay. So I mean, so perhaps pandispositionalists could respond that the examples just given, although they don't have their essences constituted by dispositions, they nonetheless are sort of invariably associated with certain dispositions. But Bird responds that even if there were some set of dispositions shared by all aromatic compounds, say, Bird argues that contra his definition of powers, these dispositions would not determine the essence, nature, or identity of aromaticity, because what aromaticity is a matter of the structure of the molecules and their bonds and electrons, right? And and again, this is going to kind of be important later. So he concedes that this shared structure might explain the fact that aromatic compounds share some set of dispositions, and he seems open to the possibility that there might even be necessary connections, right, between aromaticity and dispositions, but he doesn't think this implies any relationship of essence for sort of broadly Feinian reasons, right? So just because there's a necessary connection here doesn't mean there's essence going on. Okay, so that was Bird's argument against pandispositionalism and Bird's metaphysics of powers. I hope that was relatively clear. Okay. So now I'm going to see some problems for the Birdian metaphysic and see how we can maybe push back against Bird's argument against pandispositionalism. And this is how it's going to go. So I'll briefly outline, hopefully briefly outline some problems for Bird's metaphysics of powers and the alternative account of powers that these problems motivate, right? And then I'll show how this alternative account of the metaphysics of powers, namely QDE, blocks Bird's argument against pandispositionalism. In the next section, I'll show how we can extend these thoughts to argue that pandispositionalism is in fact true. Okay, so two broad kind of problems for Bird's account of powers, which again have been kind of going around the literature for some time now, so they might be familiar to some of you. So one type of problem is this explanatory objection. So it looks like Birdian powers are not really able to explain laws of nature and stuff like that. And the other thought is that actually maybe Bird's metaphysics of powers is just incoherent. So the explanatory objection goes like this. So we've got a question, right? How are we to understand the claim that powers explain patterns in the distribution of property and statistics throughout the world? So how are we to understand the claim that powers explain laws of nature? And there's nothing more to Birdian powers than the modal relations in which they stand to other properties, right? The dispositions, which we've said can be understood as modal relations, constitute and exhaustively constitute the essences of properties. So these are what must do the work of explaining property distributions. In other words, these modal relations must play a governing role, right? But then the problem is there are well-documented problems for this notion of governing relations, right? So in a nutshell, it's difficult to say how governing relations are supposed to do their governing work. How do they kind of make it the case that the distribution of properties is what it is? This is kind of what Lewis's mighty biceps objection and Van Fraasen's inference problem were about, I take it. But more recently, Bird has argued that Armstrong's, Armstrong, perhaps the most famous, Armstrong-Dretske-Tooley's most famous governing account of laws, Bird has argued that this type of account of laws is subject to a damaging regress, but Barker and Smart have then shown that this same regress is applicable to Bird's own view, because it looks like there's nothing more to the essence of Bird's powers than governing modal relations. So really the point here is that BIRDIAN dispositional essentialism arguably collapses into the nomadic necessitation view of Armstrong and others, and so is sort of subject to the problems for that view. The incoherence objection, in a nutshell, BIRDIAN powers are supposed to metaphysically explain something on which they essentially depend, right? So powers are supposed to explain modal facts, but as we've seen, those very modal facts that they're supposed to explain, the dispositions or modal relations between properties, are constitutive of the essences of those properties, right? And so the concern is that nothing can really metaphysically explain that which is constitutive of its own essence on pain of violating certain platitudes about grounding, right? So you probably think grounding should be asymmetrical or something like that. But even if you don't think grounding should be asymmetrical, you might think it looks like what's being built into the essences of these properties is in fact laws, right? And so we might think, okay, maybe symmetrical grounding might be okay sometimes, but we don't want a situation, we don't want to be dispositional essentialists and have properties and laws symmetrically grounding each other. This doesn't look like it's satisfying our original explanatory aims. And as I've also argued, there's sort of problems with achieving continuity with science as well. Okay, so then the point is that we can kind of avoid these problems, hopefully, if we endorse this view, qualitative dispositional essentialism, which I think was probably first articulated by Tugby, but you've got Coates also recently talking about this, and Ingthorson seems to be getting something along these lines too. So there's some precedent in the literature for this view. And so the idea is that powers, according to QDE, are self-individuating, right? So it's not the case that they're metaphysically individuated by their place in a structure of modal relations, right? Self-individuating properties. This is the qualitative part. I mean, I know people tend to mean all sorts of different things by qualitative, but for the purposes of this talk, this is all I mean by qualitative. These properties are self-individuating. But QDE powers nonetheless ground modal relations or dispositions, right? So this is the dispositional aspect of QDE. And the thought then is that a given power couldn't possibly fail to ground the dispositions that it does because its particular qualitative nature is essential to it, right? So a property instance would not be an instance of P if it didn't have P's very nature, and we assume the grounding is necessitating. So if P fully grounds a disposition D, then it's necessary that that disposition is present if P exists. And so the thought here is that qualities are something like thick quiddities. So there is kind of this is another term that's been used in the literature. There's perhaps something slightly more than just identity and distinctness from other properties, but we can't quite say exactly what it is. And that's what's doing the work of grounding these dispositions. And the point then is just that QDE respects modal fixity, right? And I think I agree with Bird that this is a pretty important feature of the powers metaphysic. There's a point in brackets there, which I won't go into. And I think there's still an important sense in which dispositions and hence laws of nature flow from the essences of properties on this view, right? So the essential natures of properties ground dispositions, which in turn ground patterns of property instantiation and hence ground the laws. So, I mean, you might think this view isn't dispositional essentialist, but perhaps it could fairly be called that. Again, maybe we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so that was QDE, and now if we see how it kind of helps us with these problems for the Birdian view, right? So QDE makes available qualitative, that's to say non-modal, non-relational, non-trivial differences between properties, and then these differences can account for the differences in behaviours conferred by different properties. And the point then is just that QDE can avoid appealing to governing modal relations between properties in order to account for property distributions. And so QDE doesn't seem to kind of collapse into an Armstrongian governing relations view of laws, right? And so it's not subject to the sorts of problems associated with that kind of view. And the incoherence objection, so since, according to QDE, the essences of powers are not constituted by modal relations, right? So that's again, like I say, that's the qualitative part of the view. There's no threat of incoherence or objectionable symmetrical grounding. QDE breaks the problematic symmetry associated with Birdian dispositional essentialism because powers asymmetrically ground dispositions, and thereby hopefully do allow for the kind of reductive explanation of laws of modality that motivated the powers theorists in the first place. Having said all this and actually spent quite a lot of time on it, for the purposes of this talk, I'm not primarily concerned with defending QDE. My main point is going to be to say, if QDE is true, then Pandispositionalism is true. But maybe we can talk about whether or not QDE is true in the Q&A. Okay. Do stop me if I'm unclear on anything. Right. So the point then is that QDE renders Bird's argument against Pandispositionalism unsound. So Bird's argument goes like this, right? Premise 1 says, if Pandispositionalism is true, then all properties are powers, right? That's just kind of what we mean by Pandispositionalism. And premise 2, if a property's essence can be specified qualitatively, so in terms of structure or composition or otherwise independently of any modal relations, then that property is not a power according to Bird. So then we can take the example of aromaticity, which is a property of chemical compounds, which we'll go into a bit more in a moment. So aromaticity is a property whose essence can be specified qualitatively. One example among many. Aromaticity isn't a power, right? So Pandispositionalism is false. That's kind of how I take Bird's argument to go, the argument that we looked at earlier on. And then quite simply, premise 2 is false given the QDE conception of powers, right? So powers, according to QDE, have qualitative essences. And so this argument just doesn't go through because premise 2 is false. So that's kind of the negative part. But now let's move on to trying to say something a little bit more positive about why we might actually believe in macro powers and Pandispositionalism. Okay, let's give a quick overview of this section. So basically the idea is that given this QDE view of powers, there are reasons to believe in macro powers, and I'll illustrate this with the example of aromaticity. Aromaticity is the property of being a chemical compound that contains a benzene ring. And then I'll argue that these considerations can be extended in defense of full-blown Pandispositionalism. Okay, so the case of aromaticity, and again, just so nothing's a surprise here, right? This is what I'm going to say, and then I'll say it. From the plausible assumption that aromaticity explains at least one disposition, and given general anti-Humean sympathies, it follows that aromaticity grounds that disposition, and hence that aromaticity is a power, given the QDE conception of powers. Right? So that's the argument in a sentence. Let's look at it in a bit more detail. Okay. So explanations are generally thought to receive support from somewhere. Typically, this is from causal relations, but non-causal explanation is more mainstream these days. So, for example, the breaking of the window is explained by my throwing the stone, and this explanation is supported by the causal relation between stone throwing and window breaking. Hopefully that's not too controversial yet. And another interesting observation, I suppose, is that this causal backing of the explanation accounts for the necessary connection between explanandum and explanans, since stone throwing causes window breaking. The two events are linked by causal necessity. Which is kind of what we should expect, right? We think that wherever there's an explanation, perhaps some sort of necessary connection isn't far off. Okay, so now, so aromaticity, right? Like I said, the property of being a chemical compound that contains a benzene ring explains a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents. And I'll just give you an idea about what aromatic ring currents are. So delocalized pi electrons in the aromatic ring are free to circulate. So then an electric current can be induced if a magnetic field is directed perpendicular to the plane of the aromatic system. The ring current then generates a magnetic field inside the aromatic ring that is in the opposite direction to the external magnetic field that induces the current. Right? But the point here is, so I've just lifted this diagram from Wikipedia to give myself some credibility with the scientists. But no, the point is just that aromaticity explains a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents. Right? So now we've got a question. Like I said, explanations receive support from somewhere. So the question is, what supports this explanation? What supports the explanation of a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents in terms of aromaticity? and I'd suggest that causation doesn't really fit the bill here. Aromaticity and the disposition to produce aromatic ring currents vary synchronically with each other. The instant aromaticity is present, so is the disposition to produce these aromatic ring currents, but we might think that causal relations are generally thought to be diachronic, right? So aromaticity doesn't cause a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents. What seems more likely is that the relation between aromaticity and a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents is a grounding relation, right? So it seems plausible to say that aromaticity grounds a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents. Okay, so all that is to say, so given that aromaticity explains a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents, there seem to be good reasons to believe that aromaticity grounds this disposition. But now, in conjunction with the QDE conception of powers, it follows that aromaticity is a power, right? So according to QDE, powers just are properties that ground dispositions. And again, the fact that aromaticity grounds a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents accounts for the metaphysically necessary connection between power and disposition, and hence for the modal fixity of aromaticity. So there's the kind of argument for the idea that aromaticity is a power if we assume QDE, right? So here's an objection, a Humean objection. The Humean might say there are no metaphysically necessary connections between distinct existences, including between aromaticity and its associated dispositions, right? Aromaticity could, in some other possible world, be associated with the disposition to warp space-time, right? But grounding implies metaphysically necessary connections, hence there's no grounding between aromaticity and its associated dispositions. That's something that I kind of imagined a Humean perhaps saying. And of course, the reply is that in the present context, anti-Humeanism is being assumed, right? So in particular, it's assumed that there are necessary connections between properties and the dispositions of individuals that instantiate those properties. So it's assumed that properties aren't freely recombinable as per Lewisian Humean supervenience. And I think this denial of sort of a principle of recombination, the idea that properties can freely recombine, so denying that is a minimal assumption that a powers metaphysic must make, right? Good. So an Armstrongian objection might go as follows. So the Armstrongian might say, oh, I just need to be made co-host again. So the Armstrongian might say, aromaticity doesn't ground its associated dispositions. There's this N relation, and that does the work. And of course, we're just going to say, well, in the current context, we aren't sympathetic to the Armstrongian type view. In fact, problems for that view motivated the powers metaphysics. So that type of objection isn't going to be too impressive. And finally, a reductionist objection might go as follows, right? So someone might say aromaticity supervenes on, perhaps because it's grounded by fundamental powers such as charge, mass, and spin. So the characteristic dispositions associated with aromaticity are not really explained by aromaticity. Perhaps aromaticity isn't even ontic, rather they're explained by the fundamental powers on which aromaticity supervenes. It'd be a kind of way of blocking my argument, because once you say aromaticity isn't doing the explaining, you don't need to say aromaticity is doing any grounding. But in response, I'd say that a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents would certainly seem to be a respective similarity, right, that can be explained by aromaticity, but not by any fundamental powers, right? So benzene and chrysene, for example, are both disposed to produce aromatic ring currents. So then we might ask, well, what explains this similarity? And the obvious answer seems to be that both benzene and chrysene are aromatic. So aromaticity is playing this explanatory role of an ontic property. It'd be strange to deny that, I think. Furthermore, the fundamental powers on which aromaticity admittedly probably does supervene, in a sense, charge, mass, spin, etc., can't explain this similarity, because there seem to be other properties that supervene on these exact same powers, such as being a water molecule, which are not associated with the disposition to produce aromatic ring currents. So the idea then is that there's a necessary connection between aromaticity and the disposition to produce aromatic ring currents, but not between, say, charge and a disposition to produce aromatic ring currents. Good. So it looks like aromaticity is ontic and explanatory. Right? Okay, so that's kind of motivating the idea that aromaticity is in fact a macro power, sort of contra Bird. And so now let's see how we can extend this into an argument for full-blown pandispositionalism. So what I've done is I've argued that wherever there's an explanation of a disposition in terms of a property, there's good reason to believe that the property is indeed a power, right? Assuming that is QDE, and also assuming a kind of sympathy to anti-Humean, anti-Armstrongian powers metaphysic in the first place. Right. Okay, so the first premise of my argument for pandispositionalism is this. Quite simply, for all x, where x is going to be a property, so for all x, if x is an ontic property as opposed to predicatory or otherwise not kind of ontic in the world, for all x, if x is an ontic property, then x explains some dispositions of its bearers, right? And so why would we think this? Well, plausibly, for a property to be ontic, it must be the case that it explains at least one disposition, right? The thought is that if a property didn't explain any dispositions whatsoever, then it couldn't really claim to be ontic. And actually, if we were cast our minds back to the beginning, Bird himself seems to endorse an idea something along these lines, right? So he seems to want to say that things like aromaticity and pericardiality really are ontic just because they explain dispositions, but that's not to. But then he will say, of course, that's not to say that they're powers, because dispositions don't constitute their essences. But the point is, he seems to be sympathetic to this kind of idea, and it's also echoed in Schaffer's scientific conception of properties, and Kim has some stuff that sort of adds plausibility to this thought as well. So that's premise one. Oh yeah, also perhaps chimes with the spirit of something like Armstrong's Eleatic principle, right? So if you think that contributing to the causal order of the world is the mark of the real, then again, this might seem kind of plausible. Okay. So premise two. So premise two says that for all x, if x explains some disposition, then x grounds those dispositions. And as we saw before, what supports the explanatory relation between property and disposition is plausibly grounding, right? Also, the powers theorist ought to say, because causation doesn't really seem right, because as soon as you've got property, you've got the disposition, right? So property and disposition seem to vary synchronically. And again, as we saw, that you might be able to object to this kind of idea on Humean or Armstrongian lines, but to do so would be to reject a kind of sympathy to powers, which is being assumed in the present debate. That's premise two. For all x, if x explains dispositions, x grounds those dispositions. And premise three, for all x, if x grounds some dispositions, then x is a power, and this is just a statement of QDE, right? So now you might be beginning to see how this is going to come together. The argument in full goes like this. For all x, if x is an ontic property, then x explains some dispositions of its bearers. Premise two, for all x, if x explains some dispositions of its bearers, then x grounds those dispositions. And then if x grounds some dispositions, then x is a power. So then putting these together, the conclusion is for all x, if x is an ontic property, then x is a power. In other words, pandispositionalism is true, right? So that's the argument. What sort of time were you hoping I'd finish, David? Should I go and do some objections and replies?
Yeah, you've still got time. I'll take 10 more minutes if you want. Yeah,
sure. Okay, great. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. Now let's look at some ways we might raise problems for this. So you might think there's a worry about Humean or gerrymandered Humean and Armstrongian properties, right? So the thought here is that gerrymandered Armstrongian and Humean properties ground dispositions. Armstrongians and Humeans are going to agree that the property of being a thin quiddity or a collection of thin quiddities subject to laws of nature may fully ground a disposition or some dispositions, But these gerrymandered properties aren't powers, right? So something's gone wrong. So the kind of quick response to this is to say, this is an objection to QDE, right? This isn't really an objection to my argument. So my primary argument is to say, if QDE is true, then pandispositionalism is true. This objection says QDE is false, so that would just falsify the antecedent of the conditional, and so would kind of leave the conditional itself would be true still, right? And so it would technically leave my argument unaffected. But maybe we can say a little bit more, because what I've said would certainly look pretty vacuous if QDE just turned out to be completely false. And I think the thing to say here is that, again, I've sort of been making this move a fair bit, but I think it's fair to say that a background assumption of the present debate is that Humeanism and Armstrongian are both in fact false, right? And so what that means is it's being assumed that there really are no non-powerful gerrymandered Armstrongian or Humean properties that ground dispositions, and so there aren't really any counterexamples to QDE. So in other words, if either Armstrongianism or Humeanism were in fact true, the powers view would be false kind of independently of any problems with QDE in particular. So this objection isn't really of concern to the advocate of QDE, who is antecedently sympathetic to a powers metaphysic, right? Of course, there'll still be gerrymandered properties given QDE, and it might even look like these things could be seen to ground dispositions, but the point is that they will ultimately be eliminable in favor of more explanatorily basic properties, right? And it's these more basic properties whose explanatory role can't be fulfilled by anything more fundamental, and not the gerrymandered ones that will be the ontic properties and hence the powers. But what I kind of illustrated with the case of aromaticity is that there will plausibly still be some macro powers, right? Okay, so that's that. And this is sort of two objections in one, but I guess they're kind of related. So something one might say is that all I've done is argued that the ontic properties are those that feature in scientific explanations, and that's just what powers are. But this is kind of trivial and uninteresting. Relatedly, perhaps one might say that the view that I call pandispositionalism isn't really pandispositionalism, because properties with non-modal essences that ground dispositions aren't really powers, right? And my response is that I don't think, the main thing that I'm arguing for is that if QDE is true, then pandispositionalism is true. And I don't think that's trivial, because I think to kind of, for the argument to go through, we have to make some substantive assumptions that only an anti-Humean, anti-Armstrongian with a penchant for powers would really accept, right? So really what's happening, the interesting kind of non-trivial point of this conclusion is that we're drawing out some implications of one particular version of the powers metaphysic, namely QDE, right? And I don't think that that's trivial. And the second part of the objection is an objection to calling QDE a powers view, which again, I think a bit like before, I could just say that kind of misses the point of my argument, which is primarily to establish that if QDE is the true account of powers, then pandispositionalism is true. But I think we can say a little bit more. I think it probably is fair to call QDE a powers view, because, you know, I don't think it's Humean, I don't think it's Armstrongian, and it locates modality and properties. So why not call it powers view? And then finally, I guess I can't go into too much detail on this, and I'm not even sure how much of a problem it is, but it popped into my head, so I thought it might pop into other people's heads, so I'll mention it. Which is this kind of idea about the scientific conception of ontic properties, which I didn't talk about in detail, but it was sort of perhaps hinted at and in the background. So premise one of my argument says, for all x, if x is an ontic property, then x explains some dispositions. And perhaps what I was doing, certainly what I had in mind, is something, or perhaps it seems like I had something like the scientific conception of ontic properties, according to which ontic properties are just those properties that feature or could feature in scientific explanations. In support of this premise, but Vetter has recently argued that the scientific conception of ontic properties is flawed, because it either makes what counts as an ontic property modally and temporally variable, or it admits far too many properties. So the idea here is that if I'm invoking the scientific conception of ontic properties in support of my premise one, maybe I'm in big trouble, because there's a problem with the scientific conception of ontic properties. I think Vetter's right, but I don't think that it's a problem for me, and that's because all I'm really doing is invoking something like the following conditional, right? I want to say something like, if a property is ontic, then it could feature in a scientific explanation, where I take possibly featuring in scientific explanation to imply actually explaining dispositions, but I make no appeal to the conditional in the other direction. Right? So I don't say anything about if X could feature in a scientific explanation, then it's ontic, and that's the conditional that Vetter's arguments cast doubt on. Apologies if that's all a bit obscure, because I can't go into the details of Vetter, but perhaps some of you have read that. I'm sure there are many more objections that you'll have, but I thought I'd flag those there for now. So just to conclude, I think that if QDE is true, then Pandispositionalism is true. Right? That's my main conclusion. I think this is interesting enough. But if QDE turns out to be the only viable account of powers, as some think is indeed the case, then the conclusion becomes even stronger, right? Because it becomes, if the powers metaphysic is true, then Pandispositionalism is true. And of course, the powers metaphysic is increasingly popular these days, so we're not that far off having a case for the straightforward conclusion that Pandispositionalism is true, simpliciter. Right? I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks very much, Sam.